Um, sorry. Yeah. So when we participate in races, often you see runners consuming, gels. I think we see runners consuming electrolytes, for instance, taking salt tablets. In the middle of a run, it's not uncommon to see runners pick up a banana and wolf that down before continuing their runs. So I think we all know and appreciate and understand that there is a need for some sort of nutrition in order to be able to sustain a long run. But today, I think we have with us a speaker who is going to be able to share a little bit more about for the benefit of all of us. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this month's session, Dr. Naras Lapsys. Now, he is a consultant dietitian, nutritionist, as well as a longevity medicine practitioner. Now, I must confess, I think that's the first time I've heard that phrase, longevity medicine, and perhaps I'll have him explain what that means as he goes about his presentation, or maybe he can feel this at the end of it. But it's a phrase I must confess I've not heard before, but I am told that he is a longevity medicine practitioner. He's been in Singapore, I understand, for some 4 years now with his family. Prior to this, he was based in Australia. Now, I've done some research on the man, and he, I gather, is arguably one of Australia's most qualified nutrition specialists. He used to run a nutrition consultancy in Sydney, Australia. Prior to all of you coming on, I was able to have a quick chat with him, and I understand he actually continues to run it, but he's been doing that remotely, over the COVID period. So he still runs that in Sydney, Australia. Obviously, he's also based here right now, and so he's also providing those services here in Singapore. Part of his work, I gather, he has helped literally thousands of individuals, regular folk like you and I, including, and so it's not just regular folk like you and I, but he's also helped professional and elite athletes as well. So really, anyone from regular folk all the way to professional elite athletes, he's been able to assist and provide assistance to. So I think we are very, very, very lucky to have him come speak to us today. And we must thank Dr. Maithili, and Dr. Maithili, I understand, is a colleague of his, and she very kindly put us in touch with him, and we've been able to set this session up for all of you. So I think I've spoken long enough by way of an introduction. I'm happy to hand the session over to Dr. Naras.
Okay, thank you everybody, and Ramesh, thank you very much for such a lovely invitation and discussion. And also to Dr. Maithili, thank you for inviting me here today. So you've already heard a little bit about me. Just to kind of fill in a few gaps, I began my career as a research scientist, sort of in the field of metabolism, and was always interested in actually obesity in men, and then transitioned my way through a research science career into becoming self-employed as a consultant dietitian, with some studies along the way, of course. And then for the last 20 years, what I've really been doing is helping people improve their health. And the idea of longevity medicine really is sort of a new applied science. It's been a strong research field for a long time, but maybe in the last 5 to 6 years, it's sort of reached more of a mainstream place where it's not just in the realm of research, and people are now very interested in the concept of how could you live healthier, health span, and hopefully longer longevity. And really my background had fit that well, because for the last 20 years I've been helping people predominantly through lifestyle and sleep and nutrition and stress management improve their health, and to reduce their risk for chronic health conditions. And so with additional study, I've sort of moved into that sphere as well. So in a sense, it's much of what I've already been doing, but now just applying even more science to it. So I see people for lots of different health conditions, obviously to improve health and to pick some of the low-hanging fruit from the health front. So when people have chronic health conditions like diabetes and cardiovascular disease or polycystic ovarian syndrome, these are the sorts of conditions that I help and see people with. But we're not talking about that today. Today it's on that sort of sports side of it. I've had a personal interest in sports and fitness my entire life. I put myself through university as a personal trainer. On a day-to-day basis, I like to swim, I run, but I'm not a great runner. I like Muay Thai, kickboxing, and I sort of practice what I preach. I do like to get out and exercise every day. And then from a longevity perspective, one of the most potent drugs we've got, if you want to call it that, for longevity is exercise. So my thoughts these days really come through on this: what kind of portfolio of exercise do we need if we want to be able to live healthily into our older age? And running actually offers some very, very important components to that, which I'll bring into the talk today. And yes, I've seen a lot of running clients over the course of the years, from just someone wanting to go out and begin running right through to elite athletes. And then I also have to thank my wife from the long distance side of it. The title slide, if you go back here, you can see, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, the Coast to Cozy Ultra Marathon 240-kilometer race. When our first child was 2 years old, I helped my wife do this race. It starts down at sea level in Bega, in sort of the southern section of New South Wales in Australia. And the race finishes 240 kilometers later at Australia's peak at Mount Kosciuszko. So it's an incredibly challenging long distance run. There were about 100 entrants. My wife came 9th overall and 2nd female. So that was an incredible challenge for everybody involved. And obviously, from a nutrition aspect, a huge number of lessons were learned from that. So what I want to talk about today is under the banner of distance running. And I think that we can set the tone for what a distance run is right now. If you're a new runner, going out and running for 90 minutes is going to be a distance run. And for some of you who are seasoned endurance runners, how long do you want to do? You know, so as I said, I can talk to 240 kilometers. So let's go from anything from 1 hour to 240 kilometers, we could say, is a distance run. Let me come at it today from a sort of a physiological standpoint. I'll talk about fueling and be quite specific with fueling, but remember, everybody is different. So I'm not giving a prescribed advice. I'm going to give you general advice which you're going to apply for yourself, for your own circumstances. I do want to talk about hydration, but from a Singapore perspective, because I've come from Sydney, and moving to Singapore, I think about hydration a little bit differently. And then comfort. And when I mean comfort, it's what are the things that you need to do to be comfortable whilst running, and where do we get discomfort from? And do we get it from gastrointestinal issues? Do we get it from pain? Do we get it from cramping? And let me just offer you some suggestions on each of these fronts today. So let's start kind of from that sort of physiological side of things, and just talk about fueling, okay? Because when we run, we require fuel. And so, well, when a human is exercising, a preferred fuel is carbohydrate, which I'm going to talk about a lot. But I also have to acknowledge, and I'll be talking about this through this entire thing is that as a machine, human beings can also be fat adapted machines, and you can also exercise in an endurance manner as being a fat adapted runner. So you really have access to two different types of predominant fuel sources, and you can create a body and a training regime and an eating regime that can utilize these two different fuel sources. So as a human machine, we're quite amazing because, you know, unlike a car, which can maybe run on diesel or on unleaded, we can run on both, but you have to be able to prepare your body to be able to do both. And in fact, when you end up having to almost choose one over another, but we can use carb as a fuel source. We can use fat as a fuel source whilst running. What we don't want to do is to use our muscle and to break down our muscle into amino acids and use the amino acids as a fuel source. It does happen in longer runs and you do lose some muscle, but we certainly don't want that to be your, you know, your default by any stretch of the imagination. And a little bit more about carbs, and I'll talk about food types and etc. later on. But remember, we're using glucose molecules, sugar molecules in the bloodstream, delivering carbohydrate to our organs, and when we run, mainly to our muscle. And then, of course, we can store carbohydrate as glycogen in various places in the body. The largest storage site is the liver, and the liver as a single organ can hold about 100 grams worth of carbs. We've got about 2,000 calories of glycogen stored on the body at any time. So that's our pool of stored fuel source, if you want to call it that. But of that 100 grams, the vast majority of the carb that we store, which is about another 500 grams, is dispersed through our muscle. And, you know, with our bodies holding, you know, 20 to 30% of our body composition as muscle, and muscle is a place that we're using fuel, it makes sense that we've got good storage there. Remember also, the brain likes to use carbohydrate as a fuel source, and the brain has a pretty large requirement. So about 20% of our energy intake in a day is used to fuel the brain. And when we're running, the brain's still working. But again, I don't want to get into too much with this, but we've also got to know that inside the muscle, okay, inside all of our cells, we have our actual muscle cell. Carbohydrates, glucose molecules, they find their way inside the cell, and they have two fates. If you're doing high bursts of exercise, not using oxygen as a fuel, you know, as part of that fueling system, your extreme end of exercise, your body is going to be able to take carb and use that fuel very quickly, and it does it outside of what's called our mitochondria, the powerhouse of our cells. And we can inefficiently convert carbohydrate into fuel outside of the mitochondria and generate fuel that's in the form of electrical energy that's going to help us contract our muscle. The price that we pay for that is, the byproduct is lactate. That lactate then leaves the cell and goes into the blood supply. We use that lactate later as a fuel source, but when you have, and you would have heard about rising lactate levels, and at what point does your lactate get so high that it can compromise exercise, there is a price to pay for utilizing fuel that way. What we really want from a distance running perspective and running in general is the carbohydrates going into the mitochondria, going through what's called the citric acid cycle, and going through what's called the electron transport chain, and efficiently producing far more electrical energy than from the lactate side of it. So we want to be using the mitochondrial energy and the electron transport chain based fuel as the fuel for distance runs to the best of our ability. So, but we have those two options. And again, it comes down to oxygen and heart rate and how hard you're working. So the harder you work and the higher your heart rate, the quicker you're going to reach these lactate thresholds. But as I said, the human body is amazing. We can use fat as a fuel source as well. So inside our muscle, we also have stored fat. Now, a kilo of fat has about 7,000 calories. And if you just think even the leanest person, we're carrying kilos of body fat on us. So if you think about that as a fuel source, unlike carb that's got 2,000, we've got 2,000 calories worth, we have an unlimited supply of fat calories as a fuel source. So if you could use it as a preferred fuel source, what an amazing place that you could be in. And so we can, and then we have about 1,200 calories worth of fat in our muscles. So it doesn't, there's not a large pool of them, but it's there. And we can also get it in from the blood. Remember, we're not just using stored carb and stored fat. We've got it coming through our blood supply whilst we're exercising. So the idea of being able to use fat as a fuel source is amazing. Fat is 9 calories a gram. Carb is 4. So when you put fat through the mitochondria, the amount of electrical energy that comes out is phenomenal. So it's high octane fuel. So let's look a little bit about what happens in our muscles when we are exercising. If you look to the left, when you are not exercising, you're not moving, our body uses, our muscles actually use fat as the preferred fuel source in that mode. As you start to exercise and your heart rate goes up, so think about running, okay, warming up. What pace am I running at today? How high is my heart rate today? Am I a seasoned runner or not? Or am I new to running, and a run that everyone else seems to be trotting along at, I'm actually working very hard? So this is very much per person here, but have a look, the blue and the black, okay? We're always using fat as a fuel source. But as the heart rate goes up and as your work goes up, we start to use more percentage of our fueling coming from carb. So we are using both fuel sources, but if we think about it, the longer that you're running and the harder that you're running, you still have a need to use carb as a fuel. And so we can start to think now already, just looking at this, as to what kind of runner do I want to be? Do I want to be a fat adapted runner? Do I want to be a more traditional carb type of runner? And if so, then how am I going to eat on a day-to-day basis, and how am I going to train on a day-to-day basis? But a couple of things to keep in mind. The harder that you run, okay, higher the heart rate, the longer that you run, you're going to find that there's going to be a carb need for most people, unless you become very, very fat adapted. And the other interesting things, and again, these are for the runners today who are maybe already fat adapted runners. What's interesting is that we know any runner that has been running for a long time actually gets better at using fat as a fuel source, and their heart rates can often be at a lower level because they've been running for a lot longer. So kind of relying less on carb as a fuel. Now, this is interesting because if we look at some health conditions, people who have insulin resistance and moving towards diabetes, and remember, many of us are developing insulin resistance way before we start to show any symptoms of diabetes. One of the thoughts that we actually have about diabetes and insulin resistance is perhaps part of the root cause of the problem is fat in our muscle cells that is affecting our body's ability to take on carbs and to do things well. And so where this becomes interesting is that if you are a runner, if you are running and you are tending to run on a lower carb background, or you're running being fasted, you actually start to force to use that fat that is in your muscle that's there hindering you and making you insulin resistant, and slowly actually perhaps targeting insulin resistance at its root cause, and actually making you less insulin resistant. So the idea that distance running for some people at a lower heart rate on a slightly lower carb background might actually be addressing insulin resistance and diabetes and helping with health and longevity. So it's an interesting place to think. But on the flip side, we can also be carb focused. You can be a runner who does a lot of running on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, who consumes a reasonable amount of carb through the course of the day. You can be a runner that needs to load on carbohydrate because that is the way you've set your body up. You might be an insulin resistant runner that might have real difficulty using fat as a fuel source, so you have to use carb. So there really are so many different ways that we can look at this and taking it. But as you can hear, it's about manipulating your eating patterns to sway yourself towards which kind of a runner are you going to be. So let's talk about long runs and what kind of preparation do you need. And again, I've spoken to lots of people who want to run their first marathon, want to run their first half marathon, want to do their first Ironman, want to do their first ultra. And we all talk about how many kilometers that you're doing in the weeks leading up and what tempo. You want to be a good distance runner, you need to have a nutrition strategy, whatever that might be. So that nutrition strategy starts on a day-to-day basis, before a significant long run, during a significant long run. It makes sense listening to what I've said about distance running and the fact that the body needs more carb, that for most people, you're going to need to put some carb in the tank, okay? And even if you're a fat adapted runner and you're going to run a long amount, you're still going to probably need some carb in the tank. We can replenish our carb stores at about 5% per hour. So that means that in order to be topped up for a long run, I've got 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrate in the tank. Okay, I'm going to need a 20-hour replenishment mode. So let's assume you're going out for your long runs on Sunday morning. We've got to think, well, are you running a reasonable number of kilometers through the week? And by the time you get to Saturday, are you deplete? Or relative deplete? We don't know. We haven't got numbers on to measure this. Are you well stocked prior? So I think a good place to start for most runners is at least the most significant meal prior to a long run should have a reasonable carb component for most people. Now, if you're running first thing in the morning, then that might be the dinner the night prior. If you are running at the end of the day, it still might be the meal the night prior, or it could be lunch, for example. If you've got a very, very physical job and you're running later on in the day, you might need to have a carb strategy at breakfast and morning and several hours beforehand. But I think thinking about the carb component prior to a significant the significant meal prior to running is a good starting point. But then also, again, I want you to think a little bit more. What kind of carb is going to be most appropriate for me? And so we can eat carb foods, and I'll bring up a slide in a minute. But remember, food usually doesn't just come as fuel alone. So when we eat carb foods, some of them are going to have a significant amount of fiber. Some of them are going to have the skin on. They're going to have antioxidants. They're going to have vitamins. They're going to have minerals. But when you digest them, are they going to have an impact on your gastrointestinal comfort and health? So if you think about it and you're about to go for a run and it's 8 o'clock in the morning and you feel like having carb at 5 or 6 a.m., which is going to be the best one for you? Which is the best one going to be for you the night prior? And an interesting way to look at it is the further away from the run, the more, what I would say, nutrient density you can have in that carb. You'll have more chance of having a more fibrous, less processed carb, something that's more whole food based, something that's going to provide you with the vitamins and the minerals and everything else, because you'll have ample time to digest it. You may have slept and you get that 5% replenishment per hour. You wake up in the morning, you've got the ability to maybe go to the bathroom first and clear bowels and then have that fuel all in the stores ready to go. But on the converse, it might be that even the night before, you still need to have slightly more processed carb because you don't want to feel this sort of gastrointestinal discomfort later on. Or you might be a runner who can get up in the mornings and you're fasted and you go out and run. Well, you're probably going to need a running strategy, which I'll talk about in a moment, that involves quite highly processed carb as soon as you wake up, because you don't have a lot of time to digest this food and to take on board the fiber. You might have to, if you wanted to eat like that, you might have to train yourself up. So having a bowl of porridge for someone before they go out and run could be a gastrointestinal nightmare, whereas somebody else needs to have a Powerade, some white bread and some honey and just get the fuel and deal with the healthy side of it as your day-to-day eating afterwards. So you really want to be thinking a little bit about this. The closer you get to running, the less carb and the less food you need to take in. And of course that makes sense, because think about what you're doing when you're running, okay? You're diverting your muscle, your heart, your blood out to the muscle, and you're working. That blood now isn't going to get good opportunity for digestion. So if you can get yourself caught up in gastrointestinal conditions because you're forcing your body to try to digest food at the same time as forcing blood to the muscles to do the run, and then you can end up getting stomach cramps and feeling unwell. So this idea that you start to practice, what is my best meal on the night prior to a long run? What is my best breakfast if I do eat breakfast before I go for a run? How well do they sit with me, and which one does it need to be? And then you start to really know what works well. And it goes with the shoes that you're going to wear, what kind of singlet you got on, what kind of run program you needed to do to get to able to do this run, this race today. So there's so many things to think about when it comes to what's going to work best for you. Now, a couple of small points. If you're a fat-adapted runner, do you need to put fat foods in as the meals before? Be careful, okay, because it takes time for fat to be digested slightly differently and slower than it does from carbohydrate. So you just might be more wary about how fat or oily a meal is prior. So from a gastrointestinal point of view, how is it going to sit the next day? For people that are not so fat adapted, and just from my experience with runners, rich, oily, fatty meals on the day before or the night before a run can sometimes give you gastrointestinal issues the next day. So possibly for many people, erring towards a less fattish meal, less rich meal might sit quite well. So talking about these different levels of processed carbs. So all of these are carb-based foods. Some of them are, as close to unprocessed and then going right through to highly processed. So as a blanket type of decision, the further away you are from a run, thinking about carbohydrate, the less processed the carb, the better. The unprocessed, the somewhat processed, and finding the point that works best for you. Okay, so I can tell you that my wife, for example, prior to a long distance run, couldn't handle brown rice. She needed normal pasta. So she, even the night before, needed something that was reasonably processed. And then whilst she was running, if it was not a super long run, she might use highly processed things like gels and sweets and lollies. But the longer that she ran, the more she needed to bring food on board. So I think that the closer you get to running, whilst you are running, and I'll talk about during running in a moment, is looking at that sort of scale and saying the closer to a run, the less processed or the more processed the carb might need to be. And also the closer you get to a run, the volume of food needs to drop a little bit, because eating a large amount before heading out for a run, you're not giving yourself enough time for ample digestion. So the closer you get, the smaller amount, which makes sense. When you go for a longer run, you don't see people eating meals, they're eating small gels and they're having lollies. You know, a lot of the time they're going to that really highly processed mode of things. And that's time, you know, it's tried and tested. And as I said, we all need to work out what's going to work best for us. So then during a long run, okay, then much like having, what is my strategy going to be leading up to a run? What is my strategy during a run? So anything really under 90 minutes, you're going to be able to wing it very well, because even if you don't have much fuel in the tank, you're going to have some fat in your muscle stores, of which hopefully your body is able to use it. You're going to have a certain amount of carb. You're going to be able to get over the line, even if you're running at a high heart rate and utilizing a lot of fuel. Really, that 90-minute mark, 2-hour mark, you're going to be able to get by one way or another. But as soon as you're starting to get longer than that, or if you're new to running and it's your first 1-hour run or your first 90-minute run, maybe you do need to start having a strategy. And it starts right from dot, okay? If you wake up in the morning, me personally, I like to wake up and run a 10K run on a Sunday morning or a Saturday morning in a fasted state. It sits well with me. So for me, my strategy begins the night beforehand, and I don't eat anything before I head out. Now, if I was to run longer, I'm going to have to think about my fueling strategy a little sooner than somebody who gets up at 5 a.m., has some breakfast, and then goes out for a run. They've bought themselves a little bit more credit. So when you start thinking about what's my long run going to be, the things you need to think about is what's going to sit in my stomach well. How soon am I going, well, prior to having a run, am I going to be running fasted? Am I going to have something, the significant meal prior? Am I going to have a smallish snack an hour or two beforehand? And how processed is it going to be? And then what's the nature of this run? If you can go out and run at 120, 130 beats per minute, steady pace, and run for hours and hours and hours, you might not need a very strong carb strategy or a strategy at all, because you're actually very well adapted and you're a fat adapted runner. If you're running at 150 beats per minute or 160 beats per minute and you're pushing hard, you're going to need a fueling strategy pretty soon into the piece, right? And then what is it going to be? So this is where people are consuming their gels and their isotonic sports drinks and various types of essentially sugar hits, because it's now pure fuel, okay? No health component to it, just a fuel component. How much do I need to get through, okay? Institute of Sport will tell you that you need 1 gram of carb per kilo body weight per hour. Okay, 70-kilogram runner needs 70 grams of carb per hour. 1 gel is 25 grams, so roughly 3 gels an hour. Somebody else isn't going to need anywhere near that amount. Okay, fat adapted runner might not need to do that for a long time later. But you want to start to know what's going to work well for you and what is your timing, and that becomes part of your run strategy. What are my kilometers? What is my significant meal prior? What is my strategy whilst I'm running in order to be well fueled? What kind of a runner am I? Then the longer you run, okay, the more food variety you need. So if you're going out for a very long run, some people, and you know, I'll take my hat off to it, the people that are doing Ironman these days, some of them are doing it all on gels. They've got one great big bead on, they've got these gel markers in there, and for the next 9 or 10 hours, it's just a sugar fest from start to finish, and they do brilliantly. For many other people, the longer you run, the things that can become an issue. You don't want to start utilizing the same fuel source anymore. You're sick of the taste of the gels, so you don't want them, and you get flavor fatigue, and you're needing something different. And so what do you end up doing? I think I'll skip it now. I don't want it. I don't need it. And then as time passes, you become more and more and more underfueled. So for the really long distance runners, it's starting with actually quite a wide pool of different types of foods. The more distance runner you become, the more you're going to need fat as a fuel source, the more you're going to need to put protein in so that you don't break down your own amino acids, the more you have to learn to eat actual food. So people get adapted to that. That's why you'll see people being able to handle a banana, or you're doing a long event and you're eating a sandwich whilst you're running. It's actually a great idea because you're starting to utilize different fuel sources. You're teaching yourself over these long runs and many times on how to get the stomach to be able to handle it. And then for whoever I'm talking to that might be contemplating to do some seriously long runs, 100-kilometer, 100-miler, I can tell you from personal experience, the ones that do well are the ones that start with a big volume and a choice of foods. And by the end of the race, they're using 2 or 3, but at least they've got 2 or 3, because many of the others, 6 hours prior, 10 hours prior, 8 hours prior, they're saying, I can't eat anything anymore. My stomach's a mess. I can't digest anything. And they're the ones that are falling off on the side of the road. And it's the people that have managed to have a strategy that are still eating real food, might not be much of anything. They're the ones that see out the race as winners at the end. This one's interesting. I don't want to tell a group of runners too much on hydration, but these are some of my experiences that I've had being in Singapore for the last 3 years. I'm under the impression, at least for me and many people that I know, that just due to this climate, we're probably, as a group of people and possibly even as a group of runners, pretty dehydrated all the time. And a simple marker is what's your urine color, and it's meant to be straw colored at best, so clear through to straw. And if on a day-to-day basis your urine is darker than that, you're already somewhat dehydrated. And much like any other fueling, going in and being optimized for hydration is a strategy that's there for you, as is sleep, as a whole lot of other things. So one thing is to say, well, even when I'm not running, I need to have some measure of hydration status, and I can use just the color of my urine as a marker. And that by doing that, even a shorter run, you might actually be running a little bit better or offsetting a potential headache or something. But I think then again, being planned, if you're going for a long run, be knowingly hydrated prior. So the day prior, why not have a bit more of a fluid strategy than you might do for other days, and just think of, actually, you know what, I do need to top up and have a little bit more water through the course of the day. And then again, during a long run, we can get by on a 1-hour run, a 90-minute run, probably a 2-hour run with no hydration strategy. Like I said, we can wing these things. We can wing the nutrition side of it. But once we start getting over that time frame, you need a hydration strategy. So are you going to run with something in your hand? Are you going to have a backpack? And if so, what is it going to be in there? Are you going to have running bottles on the sides? Which ones chafe? Which ones don't? If I have something in my hand and I fall over, am I going to break my fall, or can I open my hands? But again, you need to have a strategy. Kind of added to this, because it tends to go hand in hand with hydration, is this idea that we need to have some basic minerals and electrolytes, of which often they're going to come in with our hydration strategy. So this is something that I've been doing with some of my Singapore clients, is if I have clients that are athletes or are runners or playing tennis a lot, even when they're not training, and it's on a day-to-day basis, I've been getting them to take, electrolyte, gastrolyte type of tablets, which you drop into water, sporadically through the course of the week, in addition to just their normal fluid intakes. And part of the reason I do that is there's a good chance that they need those extra electrolytes just because of the climate, but also you might get a little bit of better fluid absorption and water absorption from the water that you are having. And the other thing also is that when we look at the gels that perhaps you might be taking if you're a distance runner, the likelihood is that the amount of actual minerals in them isn't exactly what you need, because if they put the amount in that you needed, it tastes too salty and then it's not palatable and then you're not going to have it. So in places like Sydney, when it's not hot, you could probably have a gel strategy that covers you nicely on electrolytes, and you'll probably be okay. But I think the stakes are a bit higher in Singapore. More perspiration, losing more salts and minerals. The gels might be lacking a little bit. I tried something recently, which was these electrolyte sachets that contain 1,000 milligrams of sodium, right? And I've been having them before a long run, and they taste not that great, right? And I would never run with it. And I don't think I would ever want to do a long run with it. But it's an interesting strategy, which is to load up. Then I can go for a longer run. I can do it on water. I can be less concerned. And I don't have to try to deal with the unpleasant bit whilst I'm running. It's sort of happening a little bit early. But it was just an interesting thing that I wanted to bring up. And then if you are doing much longer runs, and as I've said, maybe the electrolytes that you're getting from your isotonic drinks or from your gels isn't enough, maybe you actually need a salt strategy. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So then I'm kind of, you can think here, you can hear, I've been talking about comfort already through the lens of gastrointestinal health, right? If you go out for a long run and you start to get some stomach cramps, or you need to go to the toilet 5 kilometers in, it's just really can make your run totally unpleasant. So anecdotally, let me tell you some things that might help you. If your dinner the night before is too rich, it just might not sit well. Because as I said, it takes a while for the body to utilize fat and to digest it appropriately. Is that causing a problem? If your meals are too large, same scenario. And then I've talked to you about this layer of processing of carb. What's going to be the sweet spot for the type of food that you're eating at the meal prior that sits nicely? You might wake up the next morning, know that you can have a coffee, go to the bathroom, have a bowel movement, head off, and have a lovely run, you know. Or if your bowel movements don't happen till another time in the day, that what you've eaten has sit really well and you don't have to think about it. But you adjusting those types of meals prior, you know, is it going to be some kind of breakfast cereal, or is it going to be a Gatorade? Is milk not going to sit well, but almond milk does? Or can I eat some fruit or can I not because of the fructose? Do I have some other health conditions? Do I have an irritable bowel? Very, very common to have people to have irritable bowel syndrome. So are there foods that make me feel bloated, and then going for a run the next day, it's horrible because I'm feeling bloated and gross. So could I eat in a manner that addresses the irritable bowel side of it? So gastrointestinal and food and the type that you've chosen, you can see here, often plays a big role. And you want to feel good and comfortable from that perspective. Pain is a really interesting one. So the longer you run, if you start to get sort of pain, it can really dominate your thoughts and decide, you know, really can impact how pleasurable that run is going to be. If you're going to use pain medications, I just wanted to explain again from personal advice to other clients what can work well. If you know that on a long run you start to develop pain for whatever the reasons it might be, but you're going to run anyway, paracetamol and Panadol tends to work really well because it tends not to give gastrointestinal issues, but it's almost having a pain strategy like every other strategy. And it might be that if you know that it's going to happen, what we know about things like paracetamol and Panadol is that it takes time for it to come on. And when it does come on, it's very effective. So some people will actually do like a Panadol strategy before you even begin running. And it might be that I take a Panadol 1 or 2 hours before running, and then depending how long the run is, but let's say it's long, you might be taking Panadols every 4 hours so that you don't feel the pain as it comes on, and when the pain does come on, it's numbed, and then you have this sort of strategy to get yourself through. What I do want to caution on is I've had many athletes that have been taking anti-inflammatories and will even take anti-inflammatories whilst they're running. And one thing that I've noticed from a gastrointestinal perspective hasn't ever worked that well for a lot of my clients is that when they take anti-inflammatory, non-steroid anti-inflammatories and then do distance running, the gut doesn't like it. And then the tendency is to eat a lot less and performance falls away. And also there's been some medical literature that shows that anti-inflammatories and running can have far more serious consequences. I'm not giving medical advice here. I'm just telling you things that I hear, but tread carefully on that front. And then this idea with cramps. So if you find that you're getting cramps very early in a run, and it's probably due to a muscle group of yours that is either getting stressed and used too quickly or is underdeveloped, and it's going to more be something that you need to address in your running style or how long you've been running or something on that front, and it's not going to necessarily be an electrolyte issue. But once you start doing longer runs and you start to experiencing cramp, it again could be muscular, but it could start to be electrolyte. And this is why I highlighted the electrolytes beforehand, because you might be saying, yeah, I'm taking gels and I'm still getting cramps. Maybe you're the person that needs to do that 1,000 milligram salt electrolyte before you head out, or maybe even have salt tablets every hour on the hour for every run that you do that's 4 hours or longer. Are you a salty sweater? Do you have white on your clothing or hat, and you know you're using more sodium and minerals than perhaps other people might? So do you need to have more of a salt strategy? And in fact, you even go back and some of the meals prior have got a little bit more salt, that you do an electrolyte strategy with the drinks, as I said, on times prior. So you can, again, it's knowing these things for yourself. There's no blanket advice that I'm giving. It's each person has to kind of choose or and decide which things are relevant for them. So I've been talking for 45 minutes. I'm looking forward to hearing what sorts of questions that you have. It's always challenging. I like to be challenged. And then again, thank you to Dr. Maitli. We all moved in recently to a brand new integrative medical center in Valley Point. If anyone's got any questions on today that they don't want to raise in a public manner, my email address is there, or you can send me a WhatsApp message. I'm always happy to help and talk. So thank you very much. And yeah, let's see what kind of questions you've got for me.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Naras. And we'll be sure to share your coordinates and your contact details with our runners. And if they have questions outside of today's session, I'm sure they will be in touch with you directly. Yeah, we do have a number of questions for you, and some of them were posed even before your session. And I'll perhaps invite some of our runners to pose those questions directly to you. But before, I think before I open the floor to the runners, maybe I will sort of kick the session, the Q&A session off by asking you a question or two that I had prepared and questions that sort of popped up in my head as I was following your presentation earlier. And I must say, in the course of your session today, I think a number of us were having a discussion on a WhatsApp chat alongside, and I think we must say we found your session very easy to follow. I think sometimes you sit in on webinars and Zoom sessions, a lot of the information just flies over your head. It's pitched at a level where it's not easy to follow and understand. And I think with your presentation, the general feel and sense was that I think we could relate to it. It was pitched at a level that we could all understand. So we must thank you for that, Dr. Naras. Okay, so I think one of the first questions I had was, I think in the course of your session, you spoke about carbohydrate and fat as fuel sources. And I think as between the two, you had said that fat as a fuel source, and I think you spoke about it as channeling fat through your mitochondria that really results in, and I think the word that you used was high octane fuel.
Yeah.
Right. So the question I have is this: is there a way to train or perhaps even trick your body to use stored fat as a fuel source? How do you train your body to use fat over carbohydrate as a fuel source?
So this comes to the crux of being the fat adapted runner. And so I've had some really interesting clients in the past. Okay, so I had a client who wanted to swim the English Channel. Okay, now that can be done depending on the conditions, within a fairly reasonable time frame to a horrendous time frame. And if you can think about it, trying to fuel yourself whilst you're in the water is really tough, right? So he really wanted to become a fat adapted runner, and he'd looked on the web, and there are people who are very good at it. And so what he did, and so what I'm suggesting is that he started having a diet to begin with that had more fat in it, and he started to pull the carbohydrates down, and then he trained. So what he was doing was going out and actually doing his swims and his training with not very much carb fuel. Okay, and the body was struggling with that. And so this is what you tend to listen to. If you listen to podcasts of very successful fat adapted runners, they talk about a period of time where you make a decision to consume less carb in your diet, and B, to exercise in a manner where there's less carb coming in, and coping with the consequences. And the consequences generally are drop in performance for quite some time. And again, it might be 6 months of a drop of performance. Some people may be less, but again, anecdotally, I've heard 18 months, right? So you take this long hit. And so then what you're doing is your body is getting accustomed to using fat as a fuel source whilst you run. And you might not be running with a group, and so if you fall off the back or you're not keeping up with the pace, it doesn't matter so much. So how you do it is through making changes to your diet on a day-to-day basis and going out and doing the exercise on a lower carb background, and then putting in the time and seeing if your body is going to adapt well. And I think that many bodies can and will. Not all bodies are going to. And if you're insulin resistant and maybe, or heading down the path of diabetes, maybe you won't become a good fat adapted runner or exerciser. And some might do very, very well. So it's very much individualized. So the story to finish off for my swimmer, it didn't work for him. He tried. And all actually that happened was he did gain weight because he was actually consuming a lot of fat and more calories, and he never really got over the line. And I think that a lot of the athletes that I've spoken to were not prepared to take the drop in performance. So he felt that he had to hit these swim targets and he wasn't able to hit them. I think by taking a step back and being prepared to perhaps have a lesser period of performance, that's how you can come out to be the fat adapted runner. I don't think what you can do, and my research would suggest this, is that you can be in one or the other camp really well, but you probably can't do what you were saying, which is just to eat in one manner and trick yourself the next day to switch from being an unleaded to a diesel and then back to unleaded again. You can switch between them, but there's a time frame between the two.
So, Dr. Naras, when we speak about fat adapted runners, does it mean if you were of a bigger size or if you were fat to begin with, you would naturally be predisposed to being a fat adapted runner?
No, you might be the opposite because your body is not able to utilize fat as a fuel source, right? So it's being stored on you and you are unable to get access to it. So it might be the exact opposite of what you've said. And it's indicative that you're not being fat adapted, and you can't be because your body is unable to get the fat from the fat cells out into circulation. So that's the scenario. But once you've gotten over that hump, it's unbelievable. And it's incomparable. I can almost not understand it. I'd listened to a podcast from a fat adapted runner who could go out and run 100 kilometers and basically have no fuel, right? That's just unheard of. Most people would be eating, dozens and dozens of gels, and he was just fine because he now has it's like the holy grail, this 9 calories a gram high octane fuel of which his body is so attuned to utilizing, he can just go and go and go. But it's not the norm, I suppose. So even a insulin resistant person is going to be able to put a lot of carbs in and use carb as a fuel source, right? So that as a default is always going to be there for everybody. And that is the standard way that most people go about doing these things. But even your runners, you see yourselves, you must have noticed yourselves, the longer that you've been running, the leaner you get, no surprises there. And the less you might need to use fuel, like the new runner who's pushing and is running out of gas, right? Partly it's because of your heart rate. You're running at a slower heart rate. You're running at a slower heart rate, so you're using more fat as a fuel source, and you're already somewhat good at it.
Okay, thanks for that, Dr. Naras. We have a question from one of our runners, and I think this runner in particular is a practitioner of the keto diet, and so I think the question that is being posed is in relation to carbo loading. And we talk about consuming carbohydrates before a long run. Now, how would that work for a keto diet practitioner? Is there something equivalent for someone on the keto diet?
It depends. If you're a keto dieting person who's already been running for an awfully long time, then you're not going to necessarily need a carb strategy per se. If you haven't run much, if at all before, and you've adopted a keto diet, maybe you're going to struggle a little bit because your eating patterns are low carb, but your demands whilst exercising might not have moved across there yet. So I think there's the diet, but then there's also the training component to it. And whereabouts are you on that continuum of how long have you been in a keto diet, and to what extent, and how long have you been running as that, and how long do you run for? That would probably be my thoughts on that front.
Sure. Now we have questions. A good number of our runners are vegetarian as well. So if you are vegetarian and you want to pick up long distance running, what sort of foods should you be consuming to get those levels of carbohydrates in before long run, for instance?
Well, that's the same now for everybody, because if you're a vegetarian, you by default actually have a high carb diet in a sense, because you're going to be, everything that you eat is plant, if you're vegan, and we get carbohydrates from plant foods, right? We can get some carbohydrates from dairy, but so a vegetarian diet is going to be carb based anyhow. It's just the density of the carbohydrate. So a vegetarian is going to possibly be using legumes as a preferred protein source, for example. Well, yes, they're a good source of protein, but they also have carbohydrate in them. They're going to be eating grains and cereals and pastas and rice or quinoa or right, all carbohydrate based, lots of fruit carbohydrate based. So a vegetarian is going to be very, very well carb fueled just by being a vegetarian. And so then it's just how much do they need? And again, it comes back to the density and the timing and the stomach, you know. So you might have a very beautiful whole foods vegetarian diet, but does that mean that when you go for a run the next day, you're feeling bloated and having issues? And do you actually need to eat some more highly processed carb? Or has your stomach and body adapted to it? And you're a vegetarian that can go out running on bananas and feels great, right? And they're able to adapt. So vegetarianism and carb fueling is hand in hand.
So Dr. Naras, I noticed there was a term in one of your slides. I think it is nutrient density or nutrient dense carbohydrates. What do you mean when you say nutrient dense or density carbohydrate?
Yeah, so this is to all food, okay? So if you can look at food from a number of ways, and one way is to look at it from what its predominant calories are. So a food that's a higher carb food is going to have, you know, like I said, carb has 4 calories per gram, and certain carb foods have got lots of has kind of carb heavy, right? So that's your calorie density. A high fat food is going to be predominantly fat, 9 calories a gram, protein, 4 calories per gram. But we eat food, we don't just eat the macronutrient. So then what's around it? So a gel, for example, has very high calorie density of carb, but it doesn't have much nutrients other than some electrolytes, really. Whereas a banana is going to have some fiber, and it's going to have vitamins, and it's going to have minerals, right? So it's got the calorie density, but it's also got the nutrient density. So we could look at it as all of the other components, the antioxidants, the vitamins, the minerals, the soluble fibers, the insoluble fibers. And those sorts of foods have a much, much higher nutrient density. And we want to be healthy, right? So otherwise, I could be saying be a nice fast runner, be a carb runner, and just eat highly processed junk all day, right? You might run just great, right? But your body gets put under stress, and when we run, it's stressful. So we need those antioxidants. We need the foods that are going to help fuel the microbiome well and reduce inflammation and do all these other things. So it's finding that balance between the nutrient density, the wholeness of the food, and the energy need that you've decided to take on board.
Thanks, Dr. Naras. I think earlier on the slide dealing with pain, I think you shared that you were aware of a number of runners who popped a Panadol or 2 before a long run and take it periodically during a long run as well. So we have a related question from one of our runners, and the question is whether or not it's actually acceptable and okay to take a Panadol before a long run, especially if you're only doing a long run maybe once or twice a week.
Yep. So I think from the top, if you have a health condition or concern, then you would talk to your medical professional first, right? But Panadol is not a prescribed drug, right? So people can and do and take them under their own terms anyway. So let me just take it from an observational point of view from my clients is, and the kinds of things that I've heard from other medical professionals. So I've heard from many medical practitioners from the pain field that have said that paracetamol, Panadol types of things are an effective pain medication. So first of all, they work quite well, and that people have and do take Panadols in reasonably high volumes for quite a long period of time and show very little side effect as a result of it. So it's well tolerated, and that if it weren't so well tolerated, it would probably be more of a prescribed drug, right? So there's a lot of people taking a lot of Panadols and doing just fine. So probably for a vast majority of people, taking a Panadol before a long run once or twice a week in the scheme of things is very little, and the upside might be very, very good pain management. So, and that is something that I have seen often in athletes.
Okay. I'm going to basically open the floor to the runners that are on the session. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask Dr. Naras any question you have. I think we probably can provision for another 5 to 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
Yep. So runners, anyone on, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask Dr. Naras a question directly, or if you prefer, you can always just type it out on the chat, and I'm more than happy to be to pose the question on your behalf. Anyone? Okay. I think we have someone unmuting themselves.
For Dr. Naras, I have one question.
Yes.
I'm a practitioner of keto for almost 12 months, and I found the energy flow fantastic, no complaint about it. But I'm exploring this because the root, what you call the objective of going through this is to, I belong to FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, and I have 37% soft blocks in my calcium scan. And I'm trying to get rid of it. And I'm looking at carb as the actual so-called cause of forming plaques if it add with fats. So I have gone keto just for only that reason. And of course, I find many other benefits, which is plentiful to explain now. But what's your opinion of carb plus fats forming plaques in the coronary artery?
So coronary artery disease is, it's a disease of inflammation, of course, okay? And that you have to have a site of inflammation in the first place in order to have the immune responses that occur in there. So the development of the plaque, and remember, a plaque is just showing you where you've had inflammation and a response multiple times to such an extent that you can now see it. So even there are sites along our arteries that you might not even see from a scan that still might be under that process. So we're talking about, you need to know what the reason was for the inflammation in the arteries in the first place. And there are so many. It could have been smoking, it could have been hypertension, it could be many other things. And then it's the inflammatory response, and why is the inflammatory response doing what it's doing once it's now in those cells. So it's an incredibly complicated process. And I don't think that any of us are in a position to attribute one thing to it. It's going to be many things, of which diet can be a component. So it's looking at the big picture for each person and trying to, with the data that you have, and you've obviously got a lot of data because you've had a CT angiogram and you have a coronary artery score, is what's going to be the best thing for me. So, on a talk like this where I'm giving general discussion, I think it's best to keep it at that. But what I do want to say is, I just saw a couple of pop-ups, is people saying that, yeah, pain is not normal, and that dealing with pain, we should look at the root cause of the condition. I know that, but I also know that many people are going to run with pain anyway. And even with injuries, you talk to runners and they say, well, you should be resting. It's like, oh, well, if I rest, I lose my mind, or it doesn't seem to make a difference whether I rest or not, it still hurts. So my advice always is to address the root cause of the problem first. Yep. But if you are going to run with pain anyhow, your options are to put up with it because you're going to run anyhow, or I'm just saying that for some people, that there are other strategies. So the high order is absolutely find the root cause. But I can tell you that of the people that come in and speak to me, many people are going to say, but I'm going to run anyway. So what am I going to do? Talk to any professional athlete. Okay. They're patched up and out the door they go.
Now, Dr. Naras, speaking of strategies, just a question about SALT strategies. I think especially for those among us planning on running a marathon or an ultra marathon, I think you spoke about salt tablets every hour on the run. And so is that what is recommended, and how many salt tablets, how many milligrams should you be consuming? Does it vary from person to person?
Yeah, it does. And what I've found is that from a cramping perspective, like I said, you're not going to need a salt tablet if you're going out for a run or 2-hour run. But if you're going to go and do an Ironman or a half Ironman or a marathon, and you're going to be out for 3 or 4 hours, it's one of these things that the upside is so easy, right? So you have a salt strategy and you find a product that you like a top-in salt capsule or something. If you take one at the 1 hour mark and the 2 hour mark and you never even needed it, right? You're not going to suffer because of having the extra amount of salt. You're not going to get a gastrointestinal issue. You're not going to do an injury unless you've got some kind of health condition, right? So there's no downside, right? And maybe you didn't need it, but so be it, right? But if you did need it, and if you had a nice rigorous regime of 1 capsule per hour every hour, in hours 3 and hours 4, where the potential to get the deficiency or the cramp is there, and you've waylaid it, it was a worthwhile thing to do. So again, it's one of these things that you can just try and test and see what works well. And again, look at a lot of competitive athletes. They don't even think about it, right? They've got them on their bikes. You see it on the cyclists all the time. They've got the salt tablets across their handlebars, and they're just taking one routinely. Or if you're taking gels, then you're getting a salt regime anyway, right? And that maybe that's enough, but maybe you're the person that then needs to top up, and it might be that you just take 1 or 2 at hours 2 and hours 3. So no one size fits all, but just remember there's a product out there and there's a strategy out there.
Now, Dr. Naras, personally for me, I've noticed that after about an hour's run or so, thereabouts, I've noticed that I start a lot of my sweat, particularly down my thighs and quads, tend to become very foamy, and
Right.
I get these foamy streaks down my thigh. And initially, I had thought it was down to a particular moisturizer I was using on my legs more than anything else. But but after a while, I realized even when I was not using that particular moisturizer, I still had this thick foamy I think it is sweat streaks down my leg, and it's actually quite embarrassing. As I'm running, I'm constantly having to sort of swipe that off. And I'm just curious if you knew what that was as a result of.
So I don't know whether that is me seeing you as you're a salty sweater, right? But just it's manifesting itself to look like that here in this climate. So what about your clothes, like the linings of your shirts and things like that? Is that white and crusted as well? So
no, that's actually okay. But I mean, when I run in colder climates, when I've completed a run, my entire face and is caked with sweat.
Crust.
With salt, actually.
Yeah. So it sounds like to me you're a salty sweater, and then it's just showing itself with this like Singapore humidity, more foamy on the legs, and then in cooler climates you're seeing it as the classic crustiness and whiteness. So that's the same thing. So it would be interesting to see whether or not you are someone who might cramp more often, or the longer the runs, you're more susceptible to cramp. And because of you are somebody that's excreting more.
Okay. I'm just, again, we probably have another 5 minutes or so before we try and close this at 20 past 12. Anyone on the session has questions to ask Dr. Naras? We have him for another 5 minutes or so. Yeah, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask the question directly.
Hi, Maida.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, I've seen your longevity video clips. Is there any tips for runners as a whole or for health community? What are the do's and don'ts to live till age 100?
How to live to age 100. So you want to deal with the low-hanging fruit first. So if you have a family history or you have a disease, then you want to be addressing that one first and foremost, because you look at your family history, you look at your current health condition. So that is, if you want to call it, is your low-hanging fruit. So you invest your efforts in either delaying the onset of that health condition or managing it to the best of your ability, or can you, in the best example, which is what you've said, is actually reverse it. In 2 years' time, you have another CAC and it's gone from 37 down to 24. And, you know, right, can you reverse the condition? So that would be the first thing. And then you look at the things that we have available to us. We don't have medications yet that are purely longevity based that you can go and be prescribed. That's where the research is going at the moment. So you look at the other things that you have control over. Your body composition, how much fat are you carrying? How much muscle are you carrying? How old are you? Do you smoke? You know, how do you sleep? To what extent do you sleep? How much effort have you put on sleep? What is your exercise portfolio? Are you doing more than just zone 2 exercise and running? And are you looking at your body composition as well, and your ability to be able to be flexible so that you can get up off a chair when you're older? You know, it's looking at all of these fronts. So, you know, sleep, stress, exercise, diet, they're strong components, really strong components that we have right now. And as I said, managing and looking at your chronic health condition. And then it all gets put into that sort of that bundle together. How old am I and what are the things that I need to be working on? And then keep your fingers crossed that the research scientists are going to come with the actual longevity medications that are going to invariably hit the market as time passes, and that you're healthy enough and old enough to benefit from it, and that the drug isn't for 30-year-olds to prevent, but we're 70 years old and we go, haha, I'm perfect for this. And this particular medication is going to have an impact on critical nutrient sensing pathways and is going to help improve my longevity.
Okay, Dr. Naras. Yeah, thank you very much. As I said, I think we could possibly go on for a while more, but I think in the interest of time, we will probably bring the session to an end. We typically try and end our sessions, you know, just over an hour or so, but we've gone on for an hour, 20 minutes, and that's largely because I think there were a good number of questions to be asked, and we've had an extremely informative session as well. As I mentioned earlier, your presentation itself was very easy to follow and understand. It was pitched at a level, as I mentioned earlier, that enabled all of us on the session to fully understand and appreciate. So we thank you for the session. We've had a good Q&A as well, and I'm quite sure more of our runners, when they see this video, and what we typically do is upload this onto our YouTube channel. So we'll share that link with you as well in the next week or so. And when we do that, it may well be that more of our runners watch it and have questions that they may want to pose to you, and they may reach out to you directly as well. And we'll be sure, as I mentioned earlier, to share your contact details and coordinates with all of our runners as well. And hopefully they will reach out if they have a question, and if there's a need to as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody. Just my final words is I tell people what I think. Facts have a half-life, so what I say today might be considered truth, but in 5 years' time, it's not at all. I keep an open mind, so this information is always changing. It's part of the exciting part of looking at science and health.
And Dr. Naras, I think, when we were sort of exchanging texts prior to this Zoom session, I think you had mentioned that, if it were possible, you would like to join us for a run as well. And so I have not forgotten that. And I think when the measures ease up, that's something that we certainly would like to take you up on and have you join us. At least for our Sunday long runs. A good number of us actually do long runs on Sundays, as I shared with you before we came on. So we look forward to having you join us on one of these long runs. And before we end, I also, as I mentioned at the start, and I think this was before Dr. Maithili came on. She came on, I think, 5 minutes or so after we had started. So I also wanted to thank Dr. Maithili for actually creating this opportunity, connecting both of us, and allowing for this session to take place. So thank you, Maithili, and thank you, Dr. Naras. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good rest of the weekend, everyone. Cheers. Take care.
Bye-bye.